Tu'er Shen, or Tu'er Shen, translation, the leveret spirit, or the rabbit god, is a Chinese deity who manages love and sex between homosexual people. He is called by his adherents Ta Ye, or master. Today I'm going to share what I've been learning about Tu'er Shen and tell you why this subject is meaningful to me. First, the origin story. Fujian is the name of a Chinese province. It is there that the legend of Tu'er Shen began. Fujian, aka Hokkien province, is on the southeast coast of China, bordered by the Taiwan Strait. And across the strait is the island of Taiwan. Hu Tianbao, and I don't speak Chinese, so I hope I'm doing okay. There's nobody here to correct me. Hu Tianbao was a soldier from Fujian. He became aware of the presence of another man who was a very handsome imperial inspector, and Hu Tianbao became a follower of this inspector. Literally, there was no social media at the time. So he would go to the places where the imperial inspector was going to appear because he was a huge fan, to say the least. What happened is that Hu Tianbao got a crush on the imperial inspector, and the crush grew into an infatuation, and the infatuation became consuming. And thus the story begins. Unable to stop this growing infatuation, Hu Tianbao decided he would find a way to spy on his crush, desiring to see him naked. Hu Tianbao succeeded, but he was caught in the act by the imperial inspector. Questioned as to his motives, Hu Tianbao confessed his desires. The imperial inspector then became outraged. He had Hu Tianbao arrested and then punished. By the inspector's decree, Hu Tianbao was beaten until death. So you see, the story has a very sad beginning, but it doesn't end there. Hu Tianbao, according to legend, appeared in the afterlife and was questioned. He was questioned in the afterlife by the other souls. What was your life like? What did you do in your life on earth? How did you end up here with us? And he told his story. And there was a commotion in the afterlife, and the spirit world became unsettled. And they petitioned the rulers of the other side to do something because it was terribly unfair, in the opinion of people in the other world, that Hu Tianbao had died because of his obsession and his would-be love for another human being. So what happened, according to this legend, is that the spirit of Hu Tianbao was addressed by the rulers of the other world, who told him, we're going to redeem your soul by granting you immortality as the rabbit god, the leveret spirit, and we will send you to the people of earth to teach them about compassion, to teach them about forgiveness and acceptance, and about making things more meaningful in their lives. So Hu Tianbao was now Tu'er Shen, which means the rabbit god. There's a reason he is also called the leveret spirit. Leveret is a word for a rabbit in its first year of life. And it is known that a rabbit in its first year, unlike other mammals, dogs, elephants, there's many I can think of, it's rather hard to tell what gender is the rabbit in its first year of life. And in Chinese culture, there are stories and there are poems. There's a wonderful poem from the perspective of a female rabbit within her first year of life. And she's saying, I can run as fast as any male. Look what I can do. That's for you, Brittany Griner. Okay, so the leveret is the spirit of a young rabbit. And it's not accidental that this legend brings in the rabbit, because in Chinese culture, even then in the Tang Dynasty, which began in Manchuria in 1636, spread to Beijing by 1644, later to all of China and Taiwan, even as far as Siberia, and lasted until 1912. There was, during the Tang Dynasty, an expression. I don't speak Chinese, but I believe it's tuti. Tuti, which is taken from the Chinese word for rabbit, was used to describe young gay men, especially young effeminate gay men, because like a leveret, it was kind of hard to tell, boy or girl. And if you're familiar at all with what is called K-pop, the pop music coming from young people in Korea, you can see that there's a lot of people watching K-pop going, is a boy or a girl on screen? So this expression, tuti, was for young gay men or young men of whom it was hard to tell. You see, girl or boy, who is he? And this is why in the temples, Tu'er Shen is not addressed as Tu'er Shen, rabbit god, but as master. And the words for that are, I wrote it down. Tuti, you could translate as gay boy or bunny. Master is what one refers to Tu'er Shen as in the temple, which basically is kind of like, in my opinion, when we look at translations of the prayer of St. Francis, it begins with Divine Master. What ended up happening was that a man who lived in the village from which Hu Tianbao had come had a dream. And in his dream, Tu'er Shen, the rabbit god, came to him and said to him, I want you to build a temple. You will build it here in the village. You will ask the other villagers to help you to build this temple. And it will be dedicated to me, the rabbit god. And if anyone asks you, why are you doing this? You will tell them, because the rabbit god came to me in a dream and asked me to build this temple. Will you help? Will you help us to build it and fund it and keep it going? And then you can draw in the community. So the temple was built. And again, this is hundreds of years ago, but people came together from the village and they built this temple to Tu'er Shen. And over time, it became observed that young men, and sometimes older men, would come to the temple and pay their respects. And it was traditional, if you had a desire or a wish, to write it on a piece of paper, and then you could burn it at the temple. And many of these men were looking for love. And they knew that if they asked Yue Lao, again, I don't speak Chinese, the heterosexuals matchmaker god of China, for help, they would probably not have any problem finding a bride. But what if they were looking for another man? If they were looking for another man, they went to the temple of Tu'er Shen and they addressed their request to Tu'er Shen. And over time, couples, men together, would come to the temple of Tu'er Shen. And they would have ceremonies. And sometimes these ceremonies were known as male adoption or bonding ceremonies. And if you looked closely, you saw it was very like a wedding ceremony. And observers said, oh, down to the 3 cups of tea. It was quite like a wedding ceremony. But there were 2 men having this ceremony, sometimes an older man and a younger man. And at a certain point in time, in the next century, in the 1700s, there was a well-known official of the Tang Dynasty who became upset over what was happening at the temples, not just the temples of Tu'er Shen, but other temples as well. And he decided that society had become immoral, and there was a lot of debauchery going on, and he was offended, and he disliked things that he saw. And in 1765, he strove to enforce morality through the prohibition of licentious cults, such as the cult of Tu'er Shen. He published a pamphlet in which he explained that he found Tu'er Shen's followers very debauched. He disliked the images in the temple showing two men embracing. And if you ask people at the temple, they might say, oh, they're brothers. But he disliked the fact that male youths and men prayed for assistance finding love matches there. He disliked older men and younger men together as couples. He disliked the bonding ceremony. He disliked the offerings made to the rabbit god, which often consisted of sugar mixed with pork intestine. Now, I will point out that in our country, we call chitterlings, or pork intestine, chitlins, and they are a traditional dish in our soul food. And they have been, in fact, eaten around the world for many centuries, sometimes in puddings. I looked on the internet. There's a lot of cultures which have raised pigs and served up what we think of as chitlins. And so bringing this dish as an offering to Tu'er Shen and smearing it on the mouth of the idol, doubtless in recognition that rabbits don't have hands to eat with, was considered a gesture of thanks and respect. But our official didn't like that, and others after him didn't like that. Unfortunately, this animosity of others towards the men who came to the temple of Tu'er Shen would resurface again at other times in history, like during World War II, when the Japanese took over. Today, the nation of China, officially, I'm sorry to say, is a homophobic nation. There are things that one just does not speak about, and same-sex love is one of those things. Historically, though, some Taoist schools have considered homosexuality sexual misconduct, but mainly because the culture encourages heterosexual marriage and procreation. Taoist scriptures, however, mostly maintain a neutral stance. They don't say anything about it. Some people have said Confucius wouldn't approve. But again, if you look at the writings of Confucius, you don't find any actual words of Confucius condemning same-sex love. Societal pressures tend to push heterosexual marriage for the reasons of, one, inheritance. My late sister was a lawyer, and she said, you know, since Roman times in our Western culture, we've had the tradition of marriage, but mainly it's about families and inheritance and who is going to get your stuff when you're gone. And the other reason societies push heterosexual marriage is embedded in the words, I'm going to steal from our Western Bible, be fruitful and multiply. So some same-sex male couples in China were actually pushed to dissolve their unions and get married to female partners eventually, after say 20 years or so, to ensure that maybe they could have some offspring who could inherit the wealth of the partners. So there we are. Gotta go against the grain, us LGBTQ people. So what happened eventually is that in 2006, a Taoist priest named Lu Wei-ming in New Taipei City in Taiwan, who was an openly gay Taoist priest, decided to found a new temple for Tu'er Shen, which became the first in our new millennium and the only shrine to the deity in the world. The modern world, I should say. And the story, which I saw on the internet, is that he also was visited by Tu'er Shen, the rabbit god, in a dream. And the rabbit god said, "Will you make a temple in my honor?" And Lu Wei-ming woke from the dream, made a decision that if enough gay couples came to him and said, if only there was a place where we could worship, he would go ahead and create a temple and dedicate it to Tu'er Shen, the rabbit god. And he set a figure of time and a figure of how many people would need to make this request. And before the amount of time elapsed, more people than he had figured actually came to him and said, "We heard that you're an openly gay Taoist priest, but there is no temple at which we would feel most entirely welcome. And would you start one?" So he decided that was the answer to his request and his prayer. And like our church here in New Smyrna Beach, it was a little bit of a challenge getting this temple to Tu'er Shen in the 21st century off the ground, because Taoist priests are not people who have a lot of money. I think they take a vow of poverty also. So there had to be some fundraising, and there had to be the finding of a space. And they found a rental space, and they opened a new temple in New Taipei City, dedicated to Tu'er Shen by Lu Wei-ming. And people started coming, and more people started coming. And eventually, same-sex couples that were female started coming. And if you wondered why didn't I mention same-sex couples who were female already, it's because historically, in China as in other parts of the world, the status of women as second-class citizens means that whatever women did, and I'm sorry, but we've had guests in our pulpit here talking about Old Testament writings who have said the same thing. Whatever women did was under the radar. They're just women. They're just women. I said, really? And she said this was one of our speakers who taught Old Testament and how to interpret Old Testament writings at Stetson. She said, women were not important enough to get too much mention. And if you read in the Christian Bible about the story of Ruth, it's between the lines. Was there any intimate relationship between Ruth and Naomi? She said women weren't important enough to be addressed. So these women in Taiwan came to Lu Wei-ming and they said, we too would like the opportunity to worship somewhere and address a matchmaker God who won't set us up with a man, but with another same-sex partner. We too would like the opportunity to find a temple where we can have a ceremony to celebrate our love for one another. And Lu Wei-ming said, yes, please. So by the year 2020, 9,000 gay and lesbian pilgrims visited Tu'er Shen's temple in Taiwan in that year, just before COVID, so I'm not sure what effects COVID had. I watched some videos about this temple, and it's a beautiful place. I noticed that in the video, they said that at one point, the lease was coming up, and Lu Wei-ming said, I have got to find another place. And he talked to the people who were regular worshipers at the temple of Tu'er Shen, and they said, oh, well, we will help you. And so he found another place to move because the lease wasn't going to be renewed. And close to the last minute, the renewal fell through. And he was very afraid that there would be no place for the temple of Tu'er Shen to relocate to. But then at the 11th hour, someone came forth and said, I know a guy who owns a place that is empty. And for some reason, he just didn't feel compelled to list it for rent. But it's a beautiful space, and it's in a place near the water. And so this means that at certain times of day, the sunlight reflecting off the water makes the light and shadow dance on the walls of this space. Can I fix you up with this guy and you can have a conversation? And Lu Wei-ming was able to find a new home for the temple of Tu'er Shen that was even better than the place that it left. And that reminds me of the story of our church here in New Smyrna, because we rented space for some years. before Audrey Barcelo, in particular, among all the founders of our congregation, made the effort to get our fundraising going so we could find our own space. Now we own our own building, and it just gets better. So what's happened is the people who worship at the Temple of Tu'er Shen in Taipei City in Taiwan had an impact on the culture around them. And the temple became something that you could see on the TV news, and it inspired more and more people. And what's happened today is Taiwan is the only nation in Asia where same-sex marriage is permitted legally. Although it requires both individuals to be Taiwanese. You cannot marry a foreign national in this manner, even now. Activists are working to change the law to get more equality. Tu'er Shen has shown up in recent years in media. There was a short film by an Asian American self-described queer artist, Andrew Thomas Huang, dedicated to Tu'er Shen, which puts him in a Chinese restaurant, meeting a young Chinese American who is having some issues accepting his own sexual orientation. And in the series American Gods, which takes place in this country, there was an episode in which I think they kind of stole this story from the legend of Tu'er Shen. A young man comes into a resort motel and asks the proprietor, who happens to be a trans woman, to help. And she says, "What can I do to help you?" And he says, "I was beaten up by some guys because they don't approve of my lifestyle," words to that effect, "and the police are after me. Can I book a room?" And she says, "Yeah, okay. I need the business, and I don't like that the police are so homophobic." And this takes place in the 1950s, 60s. So at the end of the episode, Tu'er Shen reveals that he was in disguise as the young victimized man and thanks the innkeeper and blesses her. So she has a happy ending. So I like the fact that the stories of Tu'er Shen are coming out. And I like the fact that there's so much to learn. And they say that you shouldn't confuse Tu'er Shen with the other Chinese rabbit god, whose origin is in Beijing. And this one is called Tu'er Ye. Tu'er Ye is the Jade Rabbit god from the moon. And the story about Tu'er Ye is that he was the pet and favorite of the moon goddess. And when there was an epidemic spreading across the land that got to Beijing and made many, many people sick, the moon goddess turned to her beloved Jade Rabbit, her pet, and said, "If I send you to Beijing, if I send you down to Earth, will you help the people who have been so good to me and always dedicate shrines and temples to me?" And so the Jade Rabbit god agreed, and he went down to Earth. And I always imagine Harvey, the 6-foot white rabbit from the famous movie, because the Jade Rabbit god was a big white rabbit. And unfortunately, if you follow this story, you find that traditionally in China, the color white was associated with mourning. So you would wear white to funerals and you could drape the coffin in white. So unfortunately, when the Jade Rabbit god, Tu'er Ye, went and knocked on doors in Beijing and people opened the door, they said, "Oh no, Death Rabbit, you can't come in," and they slammed the door in his face. So in order to try to gain access so that he could bring healing to the people of Beijing, Tu'er Ye, the Jade Rabbit, went and discovered a place where he could obtain some clothing. And there were rich, luxurious garments worn by people like imperial inspectors. And so he put on these luxurious garments and he went back to the place where he had been rejected, and he started knocking on doors, and the people would open the door and say, "Look, it's an imperial inspector, dressed in luxurious garments." It's funny that they didn't see a big white rabbit anymore, but they saw the trappings. And they would say, "To what do we owe the honor? Please come in, imperial inspector." And then the rabbit god would come into their home and bring healing to the occupants. And in this way, Beijing was spared from the very worst of the pandemic that had spread across the land. I like that story, even though it's a different rabbit god. I like it not just because we've been going through this COVID epidemic in our country, but also because it tells a story about trust and faith and allowing others to bring healing. If I hadn't lived through the AIDS crisis in this country, maybe it wouldn't affect me quite as much. But I like that story as well. I watched a video, and in this video there was a man who makes little sculptures of Tu'er Shen, the rabbit god in Beijing. And he said, "I love making these sculptures because it gives me joy to make these sculptures of the little white rabbit god and then paint the luxurious clothing with gorgeous colors on the statues of the rabbit god." And it's traditional that there is a festival in Beijing every fall, and people will have a shrine in their home where they will put one of these sculptures of Tu'er Shen. And this man, who is a sculptor, has classes where the children come and they learn how to make sculptures, and they can each make their own little Tu'er Shen sculpture in the workshop. And I watched that, and I couldn't help wondering, how many of those kids are going to grow up to be a part of the LGBTQIA community? But if they're growing up in Beijing, they're in a homophobic society. So I have a little prayer in my heart for those kids. There's another man who makes these little sculptures, and they asked him, "What made you decide to become a ceramic artist and make these little sculptures of Tu'er Shen, other than the fact that you know you can sell them because people will buy them, and every year they'll put a new sculpture of Tu'er Shen on their shrine and their home altar when the autumn festival comes?" And the man said, "Well," he said, "I grew up poor. China was communist. My parents moved into an apartment complex, and in between the buildings there was a big courtyard, and all the children played there, and the children were so rambunctious that it was hard to even keep the grass growing. In the corner there was mud, and I would see the kids every year after the autumn festival ended. Parents would say, "Okay, we're going to take this little rabbit sculpture of the Jade Rabbit down from our shrine, and we'll let our children play with it." And so these kids would come out to the courtyard with their beautiful little rabbit sculptures, little white rabbits all dressed in fine, bright colors. And my family was poor, and I didn't have a little rabbit sculpture to play with. So I would sit in the corner, and I would make my own out of mud. And now I make my own out of clay, and I paint them. And my inner child is forever joyful, because I get to bring what I didn't have in my childhood into my life now in my later years. So things come in a circle. I want to end with a personal story. In the mid-1990s, I was living in Minneapolis, Minnesota with my significant other, Lee Markison. One weekend afternoon, we went to an art house alternative cinema to see a movie I have recommended ever since. It's called Beautiful Thing. It's about two teenagers in secondary school in England who live in a housing project there. It's their love story. After we saw this movie about the two English boys in love, we were walking on the sidewalk outside the cinema comparing our histories. Lee was a high school student in Cincinnati's suburbs in the 1960s, when LGBTQ role models were invisible, virtually non-existent. In the movies in those years, gay characters were usually villains or sad souls who died by suicide. I'm not kidding, unfortunately. This is part of cinema history. When I went to high school in Daytona Beach in the 1980s, gay characters in movies often had AIDS. So for me and other teens, our sexuality could easily feel like a death sentence. The exuberance of the two boys in this movie was at odds with Lee's own memories of his teenage years and with mine, although we prayed for a time when homophobia would be less of a deterrent to a joyful life for young people. A car passed us on the street as we were walking down the sidewalk. The car slowed down as it passed. A young woman emerged from one of its windows all the way to the waist, like someone at a parade. Gesticulating wildly, she cried out, "I love you, Lee! I love you, Lee!" all the way down the block. And Lee waved back. We walked on together for a minute. Then I looked at him without speaking, as if this were something that happened every day. Very deadpan, which made him laugh. And then he said, "That's one of the teens from the youth group." He was referring to the Minneapolis LGBT youth group at which he had been a volunteer for some time. And then he continued, "I wish you could see how she's changed since I've known her. When I first met her, her self-esteem was very low. Her family of origin, had rejected her. Her depression was palpable. She's literally a different person now." I was proud of Lee for the role that he played as a volunteer. He inspired me. It speaks to our quest as Unitarian Universalists to recognize the value and dignity of other human beings and treat them in ways that honor their worth. Thank you for letting me share these stories with you today. It is still my prayer that we will see an end to the acts of homophobia that make things like our Federal Hate Crimes Act a necessary part of the history of these United States. May we all practice love and acceptance, even with those whose words and behavior irritate us the most. May we live in light, love, and faith. Namaste, which means the divine spark in me salutes the divine spark in you. Thank you.